It's a pleasure to be in Missoula. When Isaac Stevens, who was the first governor of Washington Territory, first crossed the Continental Divide, he set up a temporary camp. It was almost an interim territorial capital of the then enlarged Washington Territory, just up the road here in Stevensville, which is named after him. And he made the comment, which I've long felt entirely the case, which is that the two garden spots in Washington Territory, as it was then known, were the Bitterroot Valley and Whidbey Island over on Puget Sound. And it's always nice to be in what I saw characterized just this past weekend as the unambiguous West, which Missoula is just on the eastern edge of. I have slightly re-altered the title of my talk, which will perhaps provide just a little bit more guidance as I weave through the narrative. I refashioned it as Creating an Occasional Region, the Exploration of the Northern West. One of the most recognizable, if not visually pleasing aspects of the outline of the United States is the gentle curve of its northern boundary, from the freshwater Lake of the Woods in northern Minnesota to the salt water of the Strait of Georgia. If pressed to answer the question, what do the northern tier of states have in common? An average American might cite the 49th parallel, a most benign aspect of geography. North and South Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington are as diverse a group of coterminous states, culturally and topographically, that one could arrange on a map of the United States. Similarly, regional students are hard-pressed to find commonalities in their collective history. There are some linkages. One thinks most readily of the great transcontinental railroads that traversed each of these states, carrying natural resources, finished products, and people to and from each other, the nation, and the world. Additionally, most of these states entered the Union at about the same time, and they share Lewis and Clark, who, as Bill pointed out, whose commemorative signage is a ubiquitous element on all of their roads. Otherwise, the constituent parts of this region usually align themselves differently. Doesn't North Dakota have more in common with Nebraska, one state removed to the south, than it does with Idaho, one state removed to the west? Doesn't Washington see itself more as California made green, or at least it was until the drought hit even western Washington this year? Isn't Washington's barbecue culture quite distinct from that which might occasion a Wyoming ranch? Nevertheless, the Northern West, a term itself of relatively recent vintage, is not an imaginary construct. It is an occasional region in history, if not contemporary experience. Once, the Northern West, from the Red River to the Olympic Peninsula, spanned by the Missouri and Columbia River systems, played a central, maybe even preeminent role in two great human epics, near legendary in their import: the Enlightenment's second great age of discovery, and secondly, the extension of American civilization to the shores of the Pacific. Doesn't the very phrase American civilization nowadays almost sound quaint? Neither, however, is exclusively an American story. One of the great mysteries in world history was the existence of the Northwest Passage, or presumed existence. Columbus, as every schoolchild knows, was attempting to establish a westward route from Europe to the fabled riches of the Orient. Instead, he stumbled upon what became known as North and South America. During the ensuing 3 centuries, the exploration and exploitation of the Western Hemisphere continued apace. But Columbus's dream of a direct northern route to the Far East did not die. Valued as this newfound land was, valued as it was, several generations of explorers and traders made numerous overland and seaborne attempts to find a shortcut through or over the continent. The first white man to lead a party of explorers into the northern west, Pierre de la Vérendrye, in 1738, came with his sons from eastern Canada looking for a water passage to the Pacific. He entered what's now North and South Dakota after previously establishing several fur trading posts north of the 49th parallel. Pursuing reports provided by native people of a westward flowing river, had word of the Columbia spread across the plains. La Vérendrye spent 47 days in the country of the Assiniboine Indians, finally coming upon what we know as the Missouri River, a mighty stream to be sure, but one that flows to the southeast. The exploring party withdrew from this country, leaving it to another generation of fur traders from Montreal to exploit the terrain. Difficult as it may be to believe, in the 18th century, maritime exploration was far more effective than the land-based variety. Greater distances could be covered, and the terrifying storms at sea and scurvy accepted, and I admit those are two big exceptions. It was far safer in terms of supply, orientation, and the personal well-being and safety of the explorers. The greatest explorer in the age following Columbus, Magellan, and Hudson, and the like, and the man who typifies what has been called the second great age of discovery, was the Englishman Captain James Cook. Cook is identified with the two great exploratory objectives left undiscovered by the mid-18th century: the great southern continent, Terra Australis, and still the Northwest Passage. We are, of course, interested in the latter. Hudson Bay had provided no outlet. The Arctic seemed impenetrable. As La Vérendrye discovered, the continent seemed wider than expected and too daunting, as of yet, for an overland attempt at reaching the Pacific. Thus, Cook took on the assignment for his third and what would prove to be final voyage: find the Northwest Passage by going east across the Pacific and trace the shore of North America until an avenue through the continent presented itself. Cook did not find his Northeast Passage, and the phrase itself is telling, though not for lack of trying. Still, his various explorations had significant ramifications and would contribute to the ultimate resolution of the question. Quite by accident, his men discovered that it was possible to make a small fortune by procuring sea mammal furs from the natives of the Northwest coast for a pittance, and then sell the same in China at an 1,800% profit. Once this fact was publicized, the waters of the Northeast Pacific were teeming with traders from several nations, including the nascent United States, hoping to cash in. But the geographic ripples from Cook's wake were equally important. Cook, who died in Hawaii before the great commercial discovery was made, was as well known a figure in his life and in death as one could become in his age. His voyages were widely publicized for their stupendous findings of new lands and new peoples in the unknown corners of the world, including the Northwest coast. And Cook was widely mimicked, too, or alternatively, feared. The Spanish Empire in particular had come to view the Pacific Ocean as its private reserve. The first breach occurred with Vitus Bering's foray across the waters from Siberia on behalf of the Russian monarchy in 1741. The traders that followed made the same fur-bearing animal discovery that Cook's men would later make, and began enhancing their previously existing trade in Chinese markets by gradually extending their outpost eastward along the Alaska littoral. This trend was ominous enough to the Spanish to prompt the commissioning of their first major northward maritime expeditions from Mexico. On one of them in 1775, Bruno de Hezada detected a large outpouring of fresh water into the Pacific Ocean, which he accurately concluded could only result from an unusually large river. He did not cite the river precisely, nor did Cook shortly thereafter, leaving it to the American Robert Gray to make the, quote, discovery of the Columbia River in 1792. Learning that Cook, the foremost sailor of his time and a representative of the far more imposing British Empire, was poking around in the waters off the temperately climbed areas of North America, was even more alarming to the Spanish than the Russian expansion. Their nightmares became real by the late 1780s when British and American tradesmen, notably Gray, began capitalizing on Cook's geographic and resource discoveries. Perhaps inevitably, sailors from these three countries became enmeshed in territorial and other disputes. One in particular, at Nootka Sound on Vancouver Island, nearly brought Spain and Great Britain to arms. Indeed, the original name of this island, Vancouver and Quadra Island, was born in an attempt to resolve the territorial dispute. The latter-day usage of merely Vancouver Island symbolizes the ascendancy of English-speaking people in the Northwest. George Vancouver had been one of Cook's lieutenants on the great captain's last voyage. He was given a dual assignment in the wake of the Nootka controversy: force Spain to capitulate its rights in the North Pacific and try, once and for all, to determine the location of the Northwest Passage. The Spanish, with their monarchy crumbling, backed down, having to forsake not only Alaska to the Russians, but now the British Columbia coast to the British. The Spanish temporarily made their stand on the south shore of the Strait of Juan de Fuca. The Spanish fort of Núñez Gallona, established in 1792 at present-day Nia Bay in Washington, was the first Euro-American outpost in that state. Spanish, however, might be a misnomer for characterizing it. The actual settlers were Mexican in national origin, as opposed to being immigrants from the Iberian Peninsula, which kind of recast the whole notion of pioneerdom in Washington. After somewhat inconclusively completing his diplomatic assignment, Vancouver took up the failed mission of his mentor, Cook. Venturing into every conceivable outlet for a possible Northwest Passage, Vancouver, among his many findings, discovered Puget Sound, named after one of his assistants. He later circumnavigated the island that now only bears his name and traveled far up the coast to Alaska. Vancouver nailed down once and for all the absence of a Northwest Passage, relegating it to the status of myth. A 300-year epoch in world history had ended. With Robert Gray's positive discovery, the stage had been set for a new era in history, an American empire on the Pacific. Only two American presidents have had a transcendent interest in the Northern West: Thomas Jefferson and Franklin Roosevelt. Jefferson, who took more pride in being elected to the head of the leading scientific organization of his day than the presidency of the nation, eagerly absorbed information about the discoveries on the far shore of the North American continent. That a saltwater route from the Atlantic to the Orient over or through North America was non-existent did not stem his interest in speeding trade with Asia. The emphasis simply switched to achieving that end by overland means. The Louisiana Purchase, engineered by Jefferson, is, I don't think this is disputable, but perhaps so, the greatest accomplishment in all of American statecraft. Jefferson's immediate objective of buying 820,000 square miles at 3 cents an acre was to secure an American outlet to the Caribbean on the lower Mississippi, namely New Orleans. But the long-term implications of the purchase were immense and well beyond that. Of immediate interest, the states of South and North Dakota and the major parts of Montana and Wyoming owe their ties to the American Dominion via this transaction. By extrapolation, so do Idaho and Washington and Oregon, and it may be safely said the entire West. The key ingredient in this transformation of the continent was the expedition led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Dispatched by Jefferson, they carried with them detailed instructions on how to conduct a scientific survey of this new land. Cartographically, to be sure, but also with a view towards identifying new species of plants and animals and establishing friendly relations with the native inhabitants. Lewis and Clark were specifically charged with the responsibility of ascertaining the sources of the northern rivers, ultimately draining into the Mississippi, if for no other reason than to document the American claim to the western portion of the Mississippi Basin. Equally important, Lewis and Clark were instructed to cross the Continental Divide so as to course down the westward flowing Columbia River to the ocean. In this fashion, the explorers were to buttress Gray's discovery, which, from the American point of view, presumed to bring with it rights to all of the land drained by the Columbia and its tributaries. This achievement, in turn, would establish at least the prospect for a land-based American outlook on the vast riches of the Orient. The Lewis and Clark expedition is claimed as a special heritage in each of the states through which the Corps of Discovery passed. Of particular note was Lewis and Clark's winter camp of 1804 and 5 in the homeland of the Mandan Indians on the Missouri River in present North Dakota. Their temporary post, Fort Mandan, offered the party the best opportunity to study the cultural and material ways of native people that they would have in the duration of their expedition. The following spring, Lewis and Clark resumed the arduous trip up the Missouri River, routinely making the first contacts with native peoples along the route. Crossing the divide proved far more difficult than expected. A fanciful notion existed in the minds of even knowledgeable people that a thin line of mountains separated the headwaters of the Missouri and the Columbia. As we now know, and as first shown by Lewis and Clark, the northern Rockies are a tangle of parallel mountain chains, and only after nearly exhausting themselves did the explorers cross the Bitterroot Mountains into the friendly home sites of the Nez Perce on the Clearwater River. From there, the trip to the ocean via the Snake River and the main stem of the Columbia was made with comparative ease. Whether it seemed so in the minds of Lewis and Clark or not, the return trip after camping near the mouth of the Columbia River during 1805 and 6 was completed in one season of travel. Not that the trek eastward was uneventful. A deadly encounter with the Blackfeet Indians in Montana, the only of its kind on the trip, occurred on this return leg. The Americans didn't lose any men. I'm not quite sure about that. I think maybe they did, but we'll find out. But American interest paid a heavy price for decades to come, shaping the future of overland travel throughout the northern West. The Blackfeet would become inveterate opponents to white men coming into their country, forcing overland lines of travel, including the famed Oregon Trail, to take a more southern course than they might have otherwise. But on the whole, Lewis and Clark opened friendly relations with a number of Indian tribes. This was particularly true of the Nez Perce on the Columbia Plain. Americans would enjoy the fruits of this relationship for decades. Even Washington Territorial Governor Isaac Stevens basked in the era of good feelings inaugurated by Lewis and Clark. But ultimately, the Nez Perce had their confidence in these newcomers betrayed, most tragically. For all these reasons, it is difficult to underestimate the significance of the Lewis and Clark expedition. These explorers proved that there was no practical water route to the Pacific, crushing even this latter-day hope for a riverine northwest passage. Their pass through the territory west of the divide, to become known as the Oregon Country, bolstered American claims to sovereignty originally founded merely upon Robert Gray. But most immediately, Lewis and Clark demonstrated that the Missouri River could be safely navigated and that the upper portions of the watershed were prime beaver country. The stage was thus set for the next era in the history of the region. Lewis and Clark's remarkable to many, safe return through Indian country inaugurated a 20-year boom period of Missouri River explorations. The organizing principle for these expeditions was the fur trade. In this we see a replication of Cook's significance, scientific exploration having interesting commercial spin-offs. A host of trading companies sprang into existence, all headquartered in St. Louis, thus that city's self-image as the gateway to the West. The Missouri Fur Company, founded by Manuel Lisa, asked George Drouillard, an interpreter and hunter for Lewis and Clark, to lead a trapping expedition upriver in 1807, the year after the great explorers returned. The Rocky Mountain Fur Company, led by William Ashley and Andrew Henry, made its first trading expedition to the mouth of the Yellowstone River, as all of you would know, at the present border of Montana and North Dakota, in 1822 and 23. Many other great figures in the early history of the Northern West were members of this team: Jed Smith, William Sublette, Jim Bridger, Hugh Glass. The latter's career in the fur trade was popularized by the film Man in the Wilderness. The discoveries of the mountain men throughout the West is too encompassing to catalog at length, so a few must suffice. The South Pass through the Rockies in southwestern Wyoming, so called because it was south of Lewis and Clark's passes through the northern Rockies. The thermal and other natural wonders of what would become Yellowstone National Park, a fur trader's discovery. Jackson Hole, offering respite from the rugged mountainous terrain, which, like other safe lodges, as they were frequently called, occasionally housed that great mart of the fur trade, the Rendezvous. This latter convention, which, like most convocations bearing that name, is at least as much social as it was business, was a vital part of the fur trade. Exchanges of pelts for finished goods, ammunition, and the like took place in the open air beside music, dance, gambling, and other frivolity. As an institution, the Rendezvous was a distinctly American response to the usual, mostly British and Canadian, and expensive system of chains of forts. Interestingly, British fur trading interests operated at the northeastern and northwestern ends of the occasional region. The first white settlement in North Dakota, indeed the entire upper Midwest, was established near Pembina in 1801. The Northwest Company and Hudson Bay Company operated in the Red River country south of Winnipeg and would shortly venture to the Pacific Northwest. Pemmican, the food staple of the fur trade, was the principal product of the Red River District. Invented by Indians in northern Canada, it was brought to the Red River District by Peter Pond, an operative of the Northwest Company. Constituted via dried buffalo meat and fat and berries, pemmican was coveted by traders all over Western Canada and the United States. Even as late as the 1853 railroad survey conducted by Isaac Stevens, special efforts were made to obtain this very reliable foodstuff. The demographic mix in the Red River colony consisted of Highland Scots, French Canadians, Chippewa, Sioux, and various amalgams derived therefrom. In 1818, the Hudson's Bay Company discovered its fort was south of the 49th parallel, and 4 years later decided to destroy the dwellings and dismantle the fort and move its functions a few miles north. In 1823, the U.S. Army's Major Stephen H. Long came to the Red River country with troops to demarcate the boundary. He found 300 Métis still living there, people who had disregarded the Hudson Bay Company's orders to move. This colony grew to 4,000 people by mid-century. The famed Red River Hunters, as they were called, roamed the northern plains, engaging in massive semi-annual buffalo hunts. Their trade in hides and fur, in exchange for tea, kettles, stoves, glass, and tobacco, founded the Dakota-St. Paul trade connection that endures to this day. The British-Canadian fur trade also prospered at the other end of the continent. The legendary David Thompson, in the employ of the Northwest Company, ranged into western Montana in 1808, establishing Salish House near the falls that bear his name. Thompson was the first explorer to enter the Columbia River system via its northern tributaries, reaching the river's mouth only days after the Astorians did. The settlement the latter founded was yet another benchmark in the road to American sovereignty in the Northwest, but the heyday of the British interest was yet to come. The Northwest Company and Hudson's Bay Company merged in 1822 and became the dominant force in the Pacific Northwest for 2 decades. From their headquarters at Fort Vancouver, so named to reinforce British claims to the territory, HBC leaders such as John McLaughlin and Peter Skeen Ogden supervised a far-flung empire of trapping brigades, trading posts, farms, mills, and ships that dominated trade as far north as Russian America. Only in the 1840s, when a persistent stream of American agrarian settlers altered the balance of power in Oregon, was the company's influence undermined. After an aborted attempt to stem this tide by importing settlers from the Red River colony, the HBC cut its losses, moved to Fort Victoria, thereby giving the British government the signal to divide the Oregon country at the 49th parallel. This was done in 1846. The Astorians, in contrast, had been quite transient. Beset by logistical difficulties and the War of 1812, the Americans sold their interest to their British neighbors. John Jacob Astor's operations on the Upper Missouri, under the auspices of the American Fur Company, were far more successful. With Forts Union and Benton, plus others, the AFC dominated the trade. After a long courtship, Astor's men were able, by the middle of the 19th century, to overcome the legacy of Lewis and Clark and ingratiate themselves into the good graces of the Blackfeet with whom they traded. The communities of Fort Benton, Montana, and Astoria, Oregon, are the only settlements, by my reckoning at least, in the northern West that have survived from the fur trade and evolved into permanent communities. Hiram Chittenden once wrote that the safe return of Lewis and Clark and the establishment of Fort Bridger were the bookends of the fur trade era. The former had indicated that safe passage through this new Eden was a reasonable prospect. The latter, a way station on the Oregon Trail near Evanston, Wyoming, was the first of its kind and marked the end of an era. Bridger had been the quintessential mountain man, but by the mid-1840s had been domesticated to the service of overland emigrants. The fur trade passed through the Dakotas. All the action was to the west, and few of the traders stayed for any length of time. With technological advances, traffic on the Missouri through Dakota changed from keelboats of Lewis and Clark vintage to that wonder of modernity, the steamboat. The Yellowstone was the first of these boats, traveling upriver from St. Louis to Fort Union in 1832. The relative convenience of steamer travel allowed into the region of the upper Missouri a breed of white man different from the usual trader or soldier. You might almost call him prototypically the tourist. Perhaps this doesn't do quite justice to the likes of George Catlin and Carl Bodmer, John James Audubon, who toured the upper Missouri to look, study, or to paint. Catlin was on the first trip upriver by the Yellowstone. Bodmer came the following year, and Audubon appeared in 1843. Though their subject matter differed, to say nothing of their artistic abilities, each was infused with a perspective on the West that soon became axiomatic. The exotic specimens of the hinterland, whether human or inanimate, plant or animal, were fast passing from the scene. Whatever their mistaken notions of the future, most particularly the myth of the vanishing Indian, all three created immensely valuable visual archives of a way of life or landscapes that it is safe to say would never again be the same. The mere presence of a Catlin and Bodmer sketching Indians or Audubon drawing birds was evidence of the fact that the frontier had been tamed. The other notable component in this vanguard of civilization were the Christian missionaries. Like the painterly students of retreating wilderness, the Indian missionaries relied upon the pre-existing infrastructure of the fur trade for their sustenance. The Protestants, Marcus and Narcissa Whitman, along with Henry and Eliza Spaulding, relied upon the Hudson Bay Company and established missions in 1836 within close quarter of the company's major inland post, Fort Walla Walla, at Wailatpu near Walla Walla and Lapwai, Idaho, respectively. The most significant early Catholic missionary, Father Jean-Pierre de Smet, used the American Fur Company's network to prop up St. Mary's Mission to the Flathead Indians here in this valley, established in 1841. Thus, the American-born missionaries came to depend upon a foreign corporation, while the immigrant priest became fastened to a native firm. The efforts of the Whitmans and de Smet led to the establishment of two of the earliest permanent communities in Washington and Montana, Walla Walla and Stevensville that I mentioned earlier. The latter, as I said, draws its name from Isaac Stevens, Washington's first governor, who used the original St. Mary's Mission as a temporary headquarters during his railroad survey of 1853. People like Marcus Whitman, in word and deed, heralded the era of the settler. Whitman wrote extensively about the agricultural prospects of the Northwest and its salubrious climate. Starting in 1840, immigrants from the border states, principally Missouri, began coming to the Oregon country with a view towards settling there permanently. After Jim Bridger's place, Whitman's mission station in the Walla Walla Valley was one of the few oases that a weary immigrant could avail himself or herself of. Over time, Whitman tended to cater to the needs of white newcomers more than his supposed flock, and he paid for that with his life in 1847. Perhaps the one individual who did the most to facilitate overland travel to Oregon and California in the 1840s and 50s was John C. Fremont. Though preceded by numerous Indian scouts, fur traders, and even missionaries, it was Fremont that became known as the Great Pathfinder. Just goes to show he had a better publicity agent, namely his wife. Fremont led several successful and some not so successful expeditions into the West, but his greatest accomplishment was the mapping of the Oregon Trail during 1842 to 44. Fremont followed the Platte River Road west, traversed the desert of southern Wyoming, crossed the divide into the Snake River country of southern Idaho, eventually emerging at the end of the trail, Fort Vancouver. His singular contribution, published after his return to the East, was the equivalent of an emigrant's guide to the Overland Trail. Fremont's multiple-sectioned map, almost like an early version of the AAA triptych, contained carefully placed notations on orientation landmarks, the location of water, game, firewood, and also the disposition of the local Indians. Fremont's more hyperbolic narrative, which, as I said earlier, to which his wife made major contributions, was one of the great promotional achievements in the era of Manifest Destiny. Permanent settlement in Dakota began in the 1850s. As a variant of the westering experience, the peopling of Dakota was far more prosaic than the vaunted leapfrog movement across the continent to Oregon. Sioux Falls was founded in 1857. The census 3 years later indicated the presence of 2,000 white settlers in southeast Dakota, including a surprisingly high number of people with roots from Washington Territory. These were the refugees from the Hudson Bay Company's fruitless attempt to stave off American migration to the Northwest in Whitman's time. The last major exploratory party to travel across the northern West was led by Washington Territory's first governor, Isaac Stevens. A former military man, Stevens headed west in the spring of 1853 at the head of the northernmost of the 4 transcontinental railroad surveys. Starting in St. Paul, Stevens first followed the well-worn path of the Red River Hunters. Once out into present-day east-central North Dakota, the Stevens expedition encountered buffalo country. From there west, Stevens followed the north bank of the Missouri River, roughly in the footsteps of Lewis and Clark. Like the missionaries, he relied upon the good offices of the American Fur Company to sustain his efforts, making major stops at Fort Union and Fort Benton. The latter was used as a headquarters for several side explorations of the northern Rockies in an attempt to ascertain the most practicable paths for a railroad. After crossing the formidable Bitterroot Mountains, Stevens came upon the Jesuit mission just east of Lake Coeur d'Alene. This mission, still standing, is the oldest piece of formal architecture extant in the state of Idaho. Constructed by Father Ravalli in 1848, and is today known as Cataldo Mission. Once on the Columbia Plain, Stevens learned that Indian-white conflict was reaching another crescendo, largely because American settlers continued to pour into the Northwest. Concerned that interracial violence would jeopardize the prospect for his Northern Railroad, an enterprise that he hoped might catapult him and Washington Territory to national prominence, Stevens thereupon dedicated himself to what in modern times could be called the pacification of the Northern West, and with about as good a result as the last well-known attempt at pacification. After establishing the civil government of the new territory in Olympia, Stevens returned to a life on the trail with his now famous treaty tour. After meeting first with the Indians of Puget Sound, Stevens proceeded to eastern Washington in the spring of 1855. He conducted a string of often tumultuous Indian treaty councils at Walla Walla, just west of town here, the Hellgate Treaty, and even as far east as the mouth of the Judith River across the divide. Bullying some tribes, cajoling others, and on occasion resorting to outright subterfuge, Stevens managed to sign treaties with dozens of disparate tribes, the Nisqually, the Yakima, the Nez Perce, Flathead, Blackfoot among them. It was a remarkable achievement in some respects, still enduring as contemporary Indian treaty rights issues will attest, but in the short run completely counterproductive. The so-called Yakima and Spokane Indian Wars, which might more accurately be called the Stevens Wars, broke out in the immediate aftermath of the governor's tour. Still, Stevens' ability to formally acquire title to the vast reaches, in the legalistic sense, to vast reaches of the Northern West signaled the dominance of the settler and his government. The Americanization of the Northern West was nearly complete. The other hallmark of this fait accompli was the political subdivision of the region. Washington Territory was carved out of the holdings of Oregon Territory in 1853. Dakota and Idaho territories were created in 1861. Montana was organized in 1864, Wyoming in 68. The Union Pacific was constructed across southern Wyoming that same year. The Northern Pacific Railroad reached Bismarck, North Dakota, and another section of rail was completed from the Columbia River to Tacoma on Puget Sound in 1873. Though this Northern Railroad, Isaac Stevens' imagined engine of growth and prosperity, would not be fully completed until 1883, its approach heralded the end of yet another age and the beginning of yet another. Thomas Jefferson's vision of a passage to the Far East and an American empire on the Pacific had been realized. Thank you very much.